All right. Hi, everybody. Would y'all just let me know in the chat if you can hear me okay, please? So tonight we're going to do a Q&A to help those of you prepare for the exam if you're taking the digital exam tomorrow on June 7th. So the way that this will probably work best is if we kind of go through the exam in order, starting with multiple choice, and then going through the FRQs, the 3 essays. So if you guys have any questions, feel free to leave them in the chat and I'll do my best to answer them. But let's go ahead and get started. So first things first, welcome. My name is Coach Hall. I have a YouTube channel, obviously, Coach Hall Writes, and I have several videos about AP Lang. So if you're trying to cram and you want a little bit more help, I do have some playlists that might help you if you're trying to find a certain topic. If not, just feel free to go through recent videos because I was trying to put together some videos to help students prepare for the exam. So when you take the digital test tomorrow, for those of you that are taking it on June 7th, you want to make sure that you are fully prepared and ready to go. So make sure that your device is, plugged in, charged, whatever it needs to be. Make sure you're familiar with how you're supposed to sign in and access everything because you don't want any complications tomorrow, especially like right before your test starts. I would recommend trying to log in and get ready like maybe 30 minutes before your test just to make sure everything's in working order. All right, so for the exam tomorrow, you are going to have multiple choice first. So if you guys have any multiple choice questions, let me know in the chat and I'll do my best to answer them. But basically tomorrow, you're going to have 1 hour for your multiple choice. So in that 1 hour, you have to answer 45 questions. And there's going to be different passages. Basically, your order of passages is different than the paper test. So you guys, I believe, start with, hold on, I'm trying to remember the order. It was like writing, reading, reading. I personally find the writing questions a little bit easier because those are the ones where you're kind of editing. And then the reading passages, those are a little bit longer. They have more questions. Those are like the comprehension ones. Those are the ones that my students personally hate. So just keep that in mind. So yeah, multiple choice questions. I feel like a lot of students find that as like their hard point just because of like, there are 5 answer choices and someone in the chat just said like, I get it down to 2 options and I have a hard time figuring out like which one's best. So here are just some general tips that hopefully might help you. One thing is to recognize that there's going to be some distractor answers. So when you're trying to decide which answer is best, you want to make sure that first of all, the answer choice you're choosing is relevant to that particular part in the passage. Because some of the questions deal with a certain part in the passage, like a certain paragraph or a certain line number. Other times it's the whole passage. So I've seen it where the answer choices, there's one where it makes sense for the passage, but not the part they're actually talking about. So if that's the case, that's not your answer. Also, if part of the answer is incorrect, then the whole answer is incorrect. Sometimes they kind of have like a word or phrase in it that makes it wrong because it's like a lengthier answer. So that would be something else to look out for. And then also you want your answer choice to be as like precise and accurate as possible. So sometimes there might be 2 answers that are really similar, but choose the one that is more specific. So for instance, it might come down to the word choice, like the nuance of the word choice. And I know that can be really tricky, but ask yourself, okay, which one is more specific? Because that can definitely help. Now, something else to think about as far as like pacing and how to read actively. This is going to vary from person to person, if we're being honest. But if there's a way for you to annotate as you go, sometimes it helps to kind of focus on the main idea. Let's say the passage is really tricky. I know my own students, they find passages from like pretty much anything around 1800 or earlier. They're like, not my favorite. So if it's really dense, what you want to do is you want to maybe take like read a sentence or 2, maybe even a paragraph if it's a short paragraph, and ask yourself, okay, what did they just say? Make sure that you're comprehending as you go, but don't get caught up on like every single little word, because if it's a really dense passage, you can still understand the passage without having to understand every single word. So really focus on like subjects and verbs. So like, what are they saying? Who's doing it? What are they doing? That kind of stuff, and figure out the main idea. That can really help if it's a really, really hard passage. Now, as far as the pacing, okay, so we got to think about how many questions there are. There are 45 questions in 60 minutes. So roughly speaking, you don't want to spend more than a minute to a minute and a half on any single question, but you also have to recognize that you have to actually read the passage too. Depending on how long it takes you to read the passage, that could vary. So I'm really hesitant to say, oh, don't spend more than this much time per passage, because I've had students who they take longer, but if they rush, then they get it wrong. So like, I don't put limits on that kind of thing. But what I will say is that it's really important to make sure that you're watching your time. Now, the reading sections, the ones where you're asked like comprehension questions, those will probably take you longer anyway, because your passage is longer and you have more questions to answer for that passage. So the writing passages, I think most students can go through a bit more quickly. So since they're kind of alternating, then keep that in mind as well. Something else to consider is that when you are answering it, if you're using process of elimination, which I find really helps, like I like to make sure I can cross out the answer choices I know are wrong and focus on the remaining ones, you still don't want to spend more than like a minute or minute and a half. Now, I did ask, I posted a video about this earlier today, actually, a really quick video. I asked over on my TikTok on Coach Hall Writes, like what tips people had if they took the first digital test. And most of them said, really watch your pacing and timing for multiple choice. One person did make a good point though. That person said, you know what, sometimes you might actually have like a question where if you spend a little bit more time on it, you'll get it right. So you have to make that judgment call. And I think that's true as well. So the editing questions, those are the writing questions. I have a video on this. I forgot the name of it, but it's probably something about like writing multiple choice. So here are some questions that you might see in that type of passage. One is like a transition word question. So the word like maybe like therefore might be underlined. So what I would do for that is read the sentence before it and then the sentence containing the transition word. And I would try to ignore the transition word if possible, because sometimes if you read it with a word in there, then it kind of like makes you think that word's right, even if it's not. So ask yourself, okay, what's the relationship between these two sentences? Is it comparison? Is it contrast? Is it cause and effect? Are they adding on? Because for instance, like if you had two answer choices that meant the exact same thing, like however and conversely, like those would be used kind of similarly. Chances are those probably aren't the best answer. Or I'm trying to think of which ones I've seen. It happens a lot on the SAT and ACT. There's like, oh goodness, like furthermore and moreover, those kind of mean the same thing. So chances are those, if you have two of the same meaning word, then one of them's probably wrong. For the AP Lang test, it probably would be a bit harder. They'd probably give you words that don't mean the same thing. But the point is, figure out what the relationship is between those two sentences and then ask yourself which word fits best, because that way you're not going through each answer choice and being like, oh, let me reread it with this word in the sentence. So for transition questions, there probably won't be too many of them, but they would definitely be in the writing section if they're there. Just figure out, okay, what's the relationship? Same thing could happen for like transitioning between paragraphs. They might ask you about like the topic sentence, like how should they best transition? So you want to think about the main idea of the paragraph before, and then the main idea of the paragraph that they're introducing, and what's the relationship there. So lots of editing questions. They're similar to, if you've taken the ACT or the SAT, the questions that have a question stem, meaning like an actual question above the answer choices. They're not like the ones where you have to figure out, should I put a comma or a semicolon? But there are questions on the ACT and the SAT that have like a question you're supposed to answer. Like the writer is thinking of adding this sentence here. Should they do that? That type of question is what you might encounter. So for the keep or delete or add or delete ones, those are another one where I would read the sentence they're talking about. Like, let's say they want to add a sentence. I would read that sentence, go to the passage and figure out, okay, does this add value here? Like, is it a definition that's helpful or something like that? And if the answer is yes, then I would look at my yes answer choices. If it's no, I'd look at my no answer choices. That way I'm not going through every single answer. I'm trying to like answer it a little bit before I get there. But yeah, I do have a video on that probably explains it a little bit better, hopefully, than what I just did. But yeah. Let's see. But yeah, some people are saying like they want to break it down like 10 minutes per writing, 15 minutes per reading. I think if you have a game plan like that works for you, especially if you've tried that pace before, that's totally fine. I just know from my own students that like I have kids with very different paces. I have like, at least this year, I had at least 2 students that would go to like 59 minutes and 30 seconds every time. And then I had kids who would be done in like 40 minutes. And it was just because of like how quickly they read. And it had nothing to do with like, oh, they got a better score if they spent more time or less time. It was just how quickly they read. So just something to keep in mind. Okay, so I'm going through the questions in the chat. So I'm going over multiple choice now, but we'll move on to essays like super quickly if anyone has any questions about that. Okay, so someone wants to know, how can I improve on writing the multiple choice questions before the test? Okay, so if you want, first of all, you want free materials, because like, do not buy a test prep book right now the day before a test. The free resources that you might have access to. So a lot of teachers probably have already assigned this, but there's something called the course exam description. So if you type in like AP Lang CED or course exam description, it's this huge document. But if you go to page like 122, there's going to be 2 passages. One's a reading, one's a writing passage. 17 total questions. If you keep scrolling, they have the answer keys. So just remember, it's like a huge document. I know a lot of teachers assign those questions in class, so you might have already done them. One passage is about a speech about women's rights, and then the other passage, the writing passage, is about NASA. So that would be one option. Another option is to go to Marco Learning. I'm not affiliated with Marco Learning, but they have some free multiple choice questions. These are not official College Board questions, but they're very close. So if I were trying to study in a pinch and I wanted some practice, I would go look at their resources, because they should have something that's free, like an answer key with it and everything. The other thing that you can do, and this is not always a popular suggestion among AP Lang teachers, but it's worked for my students, is if you're trying to practice the reading ones, there's a bunch of free SAT tests online. Do not do the fiction passages. That's usually the first one of a reading test for the SAT. Focus on the nonfiction passages. And you can ignore certain types of questions. Like, you don't need the questions about evidence. You don't need questions about graphs, but just like the general comprehension questions. Those helped my students when we didn't have access to, well, we had access to AP Classroom, but I didn't want to constantly assign stuff on there. We did SAT practice instead. And they said that even though the SAT only had 4 answer choices and not 5, it was close. Was it the same caliber? Not exactly, but it was still good practice if you want that kind of practice. And then the same thing for the writing. Ignore the questions where it's like just editing like commas and semicolons, and focus on the ones that actually have a question. So those are things you can do in the next like 24 hours if you want to cram that way. Those are my best suggestions for that. But for those of you that are saying you're really slow at multiple choice, I hear you. I sympathize. I probably was not the fastest at multiple choice either. I am much more an essay person. So really just focus on your timing, process of elimination, and then don't spend too long on any single question. Because I know when I would take tests, I would be like kind of like a perfectionist. I wouldn't want to move on until I was confident in my answer. But you don't want to compromise like time at the end of the test. The other thing is that because it's digital, the platform, like once you click submit or next or whatever the button says, you can't go back to it. So just be mindful that you should be answering every question as you go, even if it's a guess. There is no penalty for guessing. So please just put in some kind of answer. And at the end, if you're suddenly running out of time, just click a letter and move on. I recommend choosing the same letter. Usually I'm talking about for like paper tests, but don't try to make a pattern or like random stuff. If you have like 1 minute left and you have 10 questions to answer, just choose the same letter. Let's say it's like A or D, just choose D or something and do it for the rest of the test if you are like super pressed for time. I think it's like actually a myth that C is the most popular one. At least that's what I heard, but we'll see. Okay, so let me see if there's any more multiple choice questions that I missed. Otherwise, I'd be happy to move on to the actual essays. Okay, so how much time you should spend on hard passages. See, I don't know an exact limit because it depends on like reading fluency and all that stuff. But my tip for a hard passage in general is to just really focus on trying to cut the fluff and like just figure out what are they saying. So first of all, what is the passage about? See if you can perhaps identify tone as you're reading and just figure out, okay, what are the main ideas as you go? But it can be really overwhelming with these really dense passages or really boring passages. So hopefully I choose ones that are interesting for you guys. But just make sure that you are focusing on what they're saying. Hopefully that will prevent you from having to go back to the passage a lot, because sometimes that does waste time. But obviously you do sometimes need to go back to the passage to double check. Okay, so now let's talk about the essay questions. So the free response questions. So tomorrow you're going to have them in the following order: argument, synthesis, rhetorical analysis. So not the same order as the paper test. Also, you do have the same amount of time. There is a break in between. I should say this. There's a break in between your multiple choice and your essays. So just kind of keep that in mind. I was told it was 20 minutes, but then I heard someone say it was 10. More people seem to indicate it was 20. So they should obviously tell you, but you'll have a break. For the essays, you get the same amount of time as the paper test because you're doing the same amount of work. So you get essentially 2 hours and 15 minutes. So let me clarify how they came up with that number. They recommend, they being the College Board, 40 minutes per essay, plus you get a 15-minute reading period. So that's how they get the 2 hours and 15 minutes. And there's a timer on your screen, and it basically, from what I understand, counts down. That's where it gets a little tricky. Some people are really good at figuring out how much time they've spent. If that's not something that you're good at, and you have the option to kind of like pace yourself differently or keep track of time in a different way, that would be helpful perhaps. But I think everyone should have like a plan going into it. I have my students come up with a tentative plan before the paper test. And basically what I tell them is, in my personal opinion, this is just how my students tend to operate, I recommend maybe 35 minutes for an argument essay and not the full 40, because I want my students to have maybe an extra 5 minutes to put toward rhetorical analysis or synthesis, whatever they need. So it is a good idea to use all of your time, but you don't have to spend 40 for each essay. So just kind of keep that in mind as well. Okay, so let's look at some specific questions, especially if you have like argument questions. We'll talk about that one first. Feel free to pop something in the chat. But I want to go through them in order for, someone said A push, it was 20 minutes. That's what I thought, but someone said 10. Why argument first? I don't know why they chose that first. I'm guessing because it's the only one that doesn't really have anything that you read. So somehow it's faster. I don't know. I personally would have put the harder essays first because that's the way I like to do stuff, but they didn't ask my opinion. Someone wanted to know about like evidence for argument. So that's a really good question. So here's the thing about evidence. First of all, no matter what the topic is, you need specific evidence. And what we mean by specific evidence is that you need to be able to explain like who it is or what happened, and then also why it's significant, like how it relates to the prompt. So I tell my own students, like, don't assume your reader knows. So I've had students use relatively common examples for different prompts we've done. Michael Jordan, Rosa Parks, just people that they assume the reader knows about. You still should take a quick second to explain who that person is. So you could do like Michael Jordan, comma, one of the greatest NBA players of all time, or something like that. Basically, and then like finish your sentence, obviously. So make sure your reader knows who it is, especially even if it's someone common. Now, some of you might be in like AP history or AP world or other times where like you might have knowledge of people that your reader doesn't know about. Make sure you explain who they are, or if it's an event, explain what happened. Because remember, the person reading your essay is going to be reading it amidst like hundreds, if not thousands of essays. So you want to make sure that it's clear to somebody who doesn't know you and hasn't taken the same classes as you. So make sure your evidence is really specific. We don't want to generalize. We don't want to just say like some people do this or things like that, because that's not specific. Now you can use personal experience in argument. When I first started teaching, it was kind of like we were told like, oh, don't have them do that. That has since changed. In fact, the College Board has even put it in some of their former prompts. If you're writing about personal experience, the same thing applies. The person reading your essay doesn't know you, so make sure that it's clear, like not only what happened, we don't need a huge play-by-play, but give us a quick summary. And the most important thing is the commentary. So what did you learn from the experience? If it's personal experience, how did you grow? We want to make sure that you're focusing on the why it matters. That's the commentary. And then I get asked a lot, like, how many pieces of evidence do I need? To be honest, I tend to like my own students to put 2 examples that work together in a paragraph, but that is a recommendation, not a rule, because there are plenty of times where I've seen a kid focus on one thing for a paragraph and it worked beautifully. But the idea is to really make sure you're proving your point. Okay, so let's see. I'm trying to find other questions about arguments. Do you need to reference the author in the argument essay? No. So like if they give you some kind of quote, like so-and-so said this, like write up, an essay about their claim. You don't need to talk about them. You can, but you don't need to. The quote, if they have one, which they normally do, although for the paper test, it was kind of a little bit different. It's more to just like kind of give you an idea of why you're writing about it in the first place, but you don't have to reference them. And then, so some people want to know, like, how do you like create like a database of evidence for the argument essay? This is something that I've tried with my own students, and we end up like giving up on it because I've seen like I've tried my students try this too. Like I've seen people do spreadsheets and stuff. Here's what I think has really helped is just kind of realizing where your strengths lie. So for instance, like I tell my students, okay, come up with like a quick list of like people or events that you can speak knowledgeably about. And I've had students in the past tell me, yeah, but I'm not in a push. I don't know that much about history, or like I can't come up with sophisticated examples. Honestly, that's okay as long as your evidence is specific and it's relevant. So don't put too much pressure on yourself to try to sound fancy or sound smart, because your job is just to be convincing. So I've read essays that other teachers might think, oh, well, that's not very sophisticated. But the kids still made a 4 out of 6 because they proved their point. So one quick example is I teach in Arkansas, and I'm part of this group that we read essays from kids in Arkansas. And one of the essays that stood out to me the most 2 years ago was about how Russell Westbrook is overrated. Now, I knew nothing about who Russell Westbrook was because I don't follow professional basketball really anymore. But the student clearly knew a lot about it and had a very strong opinion and included facts. And like, as someone who appreciates sports, I found it very much like a piece of sports journalism. But they basically proved without a doubt why this guy's overrated. And even though I had no clue who he was, I believed the writer because of the way they constructed the essay. And it did well. It scored well. I read one this year about how the movie Moana is overrated. And you might think, oh, that's not like a really fancy topic. No, it wasn't. But the student had like 3 well-developed paragraphs explaining why. I know one was plot. One was songs, and I think character development. It might have been in a different order, which think about the order of your paragraphs as you're writing as well. But they had me convinced by the end of it that Moana was overrated. So don't put too much pressure on yourself about choosing like these really fancy examples. Choose something that you can prove. Make sure that you have a claim. And I do recommend kind of planning your paragraphs in advance, but I'm talking like really quick bullet points. Like paragraph 1 is going to be about this, paragraph 2 about this, that way that you have a line of reasoning. So it does help to make sure that your paragraphs are in a logical order as well. Now, another question that comes up, what was the prompt? These were both about the overrated prompt, which was from 2019. So one of the things that comes up a lot is, do I need a counterclaim and rebuttal? No, technically you don't. You can use it to make your argument more sophisticated, but a lot of times it falls flat. So if you have time for a counterclaim and rebuttal and you think it would help your argument, like you think it adds some kind of insight or nuance, then absolutely go ahead and add it. I've seen most students kind of have that as like a third body paragraph, though sometimes I've seen it be the first paragraph. It really just kind of depends on where it fits. You do not need a conclusion either. Is it nice to have one? Yes. But if you are running out of time for any of your essays, then first of all, the 2 things that are like not necessary, you do not need a lengthy introduction. It can just be a thesis, and that's okay. We don't need a bunch of fluff. So short intros, because the clock is ticking, and also conclusions are not necessary. So yeah, it's okay to skip the introduction and only write a thesis, because the thesis is what gets you the point, not the extra fluff around it. Now, do I prefer that students write a couple sentences of a lead-in? Yes. Is that realistic for everyone? No. So do what's best for you. I've even seen kids, like for the digital test, it would be like you write your thesis, and then if there's time at the end, you go back and kind of like add a little bit more to your intro before you submit. But yeah, ways to cut down time and still kind of keep the rubric in mind is no fluffy intros, just a thesis or like a sentence or two in a thesis. And then the conclusions, like if you are really good at writing conclusions, then by all means go for it. But if you are really struggling and trying to find time for those body paragraphs, in my opinion, the body paragraphs are more important because remember, that's where you get up to 4 points of your score. So I tell my students to focus on the body paragraphs. And I've actually had kids, it was last year when they had like the rhetorical analysis essay during the pandemic, like they didn't have time to finish. They still scored a qualifying score because the paragraphs were developed. So just kind of keep that in mind. Someone asked, do you need a variety of different types of evidence? It kind of depends on the prompt, to be honest, but it can be good. So I've seen students pair, like, for instance, a historical example with a contemporary example. And kind of like there was a reason why they paired those together. Or even like just like an outside example and then a personal example. So it's not really about the type of evidence so much as what you're doing with it. So you don't have to have like 5 different categories of evidence per se. I would be a little hesitant to only have historical evidence or only have personal evidence unless the prompt warrants it. And the College Board seems to kind of be, I guess, like not changing how they do things, but they seem to be kind of having more open-ended prompts. So at the end of the day, just remember that all you're supposed to do is just answer the prompt, like assert a position and defend that position. And you are writing under pressure. So please remember this for all your essays. They're a rough draft. And the people reading your essay read to reward you for what you do well. It's not like, oh, they did a bad job on this, I'm taking away a point. Nope. You can only earn points. It's a progression. So write the most convincing argument that you can. You can also include a counter argument in synthesis, but a synthesis is an argument with sources. So a counterclaim and rebuttal is just a technique to improve your arguments. So you can do it, but you don't have to. It is not required for any of the essays. It can help your essay, but it's not required. There's nothing that says that you actually have to have it. Someone said, oh man, I'm good at intros. Okay, so if you're good at it and it doesn't take a whole lot of time for you, if you can write them quickly, then go for it. If you think it would help the quality of your essay, then go for it. I'm not saying you can't do it. I just know a lot of kids who like, when they're pressed for time, that's the first thing that needs to go is all that fluff and the intro. If it's not fluff when you write it, then that's totally okay. I'm speaking generally here. So like take what I say and then ask yourself, does it apply to me or not? Can you use 2 body paragraphs? Absolutely. Generally speaking, we're looking for quality over quantity. So for all 3 essays, technically, I would say the minimum you should do is 2 body paragraphs. But I've seen where students try for 3, and I almost wish they had just done 2, because in their efforts to go for 3, they kind of made like 3 underdeveloped claims that were less convincing than if they had just made 2 claims that they fully developed. So I'm a big proponent of like just really developing your ideas. And if it's 2 paragraphs, it's 2. If it's 3, it's 3. It depends on, I think, your connection to the prompt. Like some prompts are harder than others. I think it depends on like whether you like that style of essay or not. And so there's a lot of factors. So I would say no fewer than 2 body paragraphs. But if you really feel like you would be forcing it for 3, then don't force it. Really focus on the 2 and focus on the quality. If you plan for a rebuttal, but it's underdeveloped by the time runs out, would it be better to delete it? I'm leaning toward yes. That's one of the ones where I feel like I'd have to kind of see it. But if you acknowledge the counter argument and then you don't have time to refute it, then I'm worried it would seem like you were contradicting yourself. So in that case, yes, then it probably would be better. It's a judgment call, but if I think I know what you're saying, then yeah, like you don't want to contradict yourself and you don't want it to like fall flat either. So before you start writing that counterclaim and rebuttal, ask yourself, do I have enough time? Because if you write it and then you have to end up deleting it anyway, then maybe you could have spent that time differently. So just kind of keep that in mind. My teacher suggested if that we have 3 lines of argument and you're running out of time for the 3rd one, just use it in the counter argument. That's a fair statement too. That's something that like, if you've practiced that, especially, I think that's totally fair. Let's see. Should I just rewrite my thesis and put it in my conclusion? Okay, I have mixed feelings about this. I used to tell my students to do that. We have since, I don't know, a worst case scenario, yes. I don't know. The one sentence conclusions feel really flat to me. But here's why it could be helpful. If it wasn't defensible the first time, then it could be better the second time. But it just feels weird, like for me personally, and this is just an opinion, this does not affect how I score an essay. When I've read like this beautiful essay and then the last sentence is just like, and I like restating everything I just read, because it doesn't take very long to read a 4-paragraph essay, it kind of falls flat. So I've heard a lot of AP Lang teachers say like it has to contribute value to the essay. I tell my students that instead of like a 1-sentence conclusion, there's a few options. Just end your last body paragraph in a way that like makes your essay feel like it's finished. That's one option. Something else to do is to, if you don't have much time, instead of like restating your thesis, really dig into the so what. So whatever your prompt is about, why does that topic matter, especially to society? So for argument and synthesis, like what's the big deal? Why are we talking about the issue? What are the short-term or long-term implications? So if you're going to have a really short conclusion, then maybe have like deeper insight if possible. It's not wrong to just restate your thesis. It just kind of, I don't know, sometimes it falls flat and we want to end our essay on a positive note, but like it should not impact your score. How important is grammar and spelling? Okay, so not very, as long as it's readable. And when I tell my students to go back and proofread, if there's an obvious spelling error or grammatical error, then fix it. But like, I'm more concerned about the content than I am the spelling, especially because there's a variety of reasons why people spell things incorrectly. It could be that they're not a native English speaker. It could be that maybe they have different challenges and stuff like that. So as long as I can read it, it's fine. And as an English teacher, I'm used to reading all different kinds of spellings. Quick story, and this is just anecdotal evidence, but I had a student a few years ago who made a 4 composite on the exam. This student, I believe, had undiagnosed dyslexia. This student spelled everything phonetically, or not everything, but most things. You could still read it. You could still understand it. The spelling was not quite right. Her essays were fine. So I do think it's good to kind of proofread, and if it's obvious and you know how to fix it, great. But is a typo here or there going to impact your score? No, because it's a rough draft and you only have approximately 40 minutes. So I would focus more on your content if you're going back to proofread, as opposed to trying to find every single comma and stuff. Now, is it easier to read with correct grammar? Yes. But do we see essays that don't have correct grammar all the time? Absolutely. You know, you're human. You're allowed to make mistakes. Okay, let me see. Yeah, sometimes addressing the counter argument can help you earn the sophistication point, but it's not guaranteed. It has to like add like deeper insight. My appealing teacher said most of the higher scoring essays acknowledge the counter argument. They do, but they have to do it well. I've seen a lot of kids just kind of throw it in there and it fell flat. So there has to be a reason you're doing it, and it has to offer like deeper insight. Let's see. Okay, I'm trying to scroll through really quickly just to see if there's anything more about argument. Otherwise, I'm happy to move on to synthesis. What do you recommend doing right now to prepare for the exam? Depends on what you like to do to prepare. If you like to watch videos, then I recommend the videos on my channel. My own students have told me that it's nice that I just do voiceover because they can fold their laundry and listen to the videos at the same time. So there's that. If you are the type that likes to read instead, if you have not looked at the College Board's released essays, I would read those and look at, okay, here's the essay, here's the score. They're going to be in 2 separate documents, but they have them for 2018 and 2019. And then there are some for 2020, but they're rhetorical analysis. So I personally like to see like how the person wrote the essay and then how it was scored and why. So that could be something, but your teacher might have already assigned those or shown those to you, but those are the 2 things. There's also other people who make videos too. So, Garden of English, Marco Learning. So if I would recommend, instead of just casting a wide net and watching every single video, choose something you genuinely want to learn about and get better at. and like kind of focus that way. So regardless of how you want to study, whether it's videos or just reading essays, narrow it down to like focus on one or two things that you genuinely want to learn more about or improve upon before tomorrow. Don't just try to learn all the things necessarily, because sometimes I just think that's counterproductive. Okay, so let's talk about synthesis. Someone said, I've seen all the videos. Well, thank you. Let's see. Okay, I wish there was a way to like categorize the stuff in the chat, because that would make my life easier, but there apparently isn't. So let's see. So for synthesis, I know someone asked, I can't find the exact comment, but I know someone asked about like sources and like pairing evidence. One of the things that I personally noticed when I read the samples from the College Board that were higher scoring is that students put sources into what we call conversation with each other. And I know that phrasing is kind of weird, but if you think about a conversation, let's say you're talking to your friends, there are certain things that you do in conversation. You might add to the conversation by bringing up new examples or evidence. You might agree with what they say. You might disagree with what they say. So an essay like the synthesis essay kind of works a little bit similarly when we're trying to plan our main ideas. So first of all, you're going to see a paragraph that gives you some context about the issue. You want to read this because some of these issues that they have had on the exam in the past are ones that you're probably familiar with. Like on the paper test, it was about handwriting. You probably all know about that, but you're not going to have that prompt. A couple years ago, it was about wind farms. Now, unless you've seen a wind farm or live near a wind farm, you might not know a whole lot about it. So you want to read the paragraph that kind of tells you why we're talking about the issue in the first place. Usually the College Board does a really good job of giving like sort of both perspectives. So some people think this, other people think this. So that kind of helps before you actually read the prompt. Then the prompt is going to be usually in the next paragraph. It's going to tell you to write an essay about, and then the topic. Sometimes it helps to kind of turn that into a question because it is a statement. So you want to figure out, okay, what am I supposed to be focusing on? And then as you are reading the sources, it's usually a good idea to annotate at least a little bit and figure out the main idea of each. And sometimes I have my own students kind of pair different things together. So once they kind of figure out, okay, here are the things that I would say, we want to kind of figure out, okay, what is your main idea and which sources could you use to prove that main idea? So let's say it's source A and source D. We want to ask ourselves, okay, like why would you pair those together? Is it because they're talking about the same topic? Is it because they're bringing up the same point? Is it because they contradict each other? Like, could you set up some kind of counterclaim and rebuttal that way? So usually it helps to have two different sources per paragraph. It's not mandatory that you do this though, but what happens sometimes is when you write one paragraph and you have one source and another paragraph and another source and another paragraph and a third source, it kind of reads like you're summarizing the sources and you don't want to do that. So by putting two sources in conversation, that's what you're actually doing. You're synthesizing. So a synthesis is kind of like when you take all the ingredients and you blend them together, I guess. It's like taking different bits of research or different opinions and perspectives and using it to support your own argument. So if you can put two sources in one paragraph, that's good. Now, we don't want to put a ton of evidence together and then commentary. I usually recommend to layer it. So we want to have our topic sentence, some evidence, commentary, that kind of thing. So instead of just like throwing in too much evidence, you need to make sure you explain the significance of that evidence. So like, why does it matter? Things like that. The other thing that you must absolutely remember for synthesis tomorrow is that you need 3 sources before you submit that essay. Because remember, once you submit, you can't go back to it. Please make sure you have clearly cited your 3 sources. That's another reason why, especially for those of you that can sometimes only write 2 body paragraphs because of the timing, if you put more than 1 source per paragraph, then you've hit those 3 sources. Generally speaking, I feel like a lot of students do 4 just because it helps kind of build what they're saying. And then also if they accidentally forget to cite one, then they would at least have 3. So remember that you have to cite the different sources though. So if you cite source B, source A, and source B, that's 3 citations, but it's only 2 sources because you cited source B twice. You can cite the source more than once. It doesn't count as 2 sources. How do you suggest we cite? I personally like it when students do the parentheses and like source A at the end of the sentence, kind of like you would do in MLA format. But that is just my preference. It does not matter to me as long as you've cited it how the College Board suggests. So they kind of give you two options. One is to put the author's name, and they do tell you that. One is to put source A. So be consistent though. Like if you're going to cite it as like author name or whatever else they tell you, then keep that consistent. If you're going to do source A, source B, whatever, then only do it that way. The reason why I like source A and source B is because when I'm looking at a synthesis, I remember them by their letter and not who wrote them. That's all. But again, personal preference has nothing to do with your score. I think most students tend to cite it as the letter, but it's neither here nor there, as long as you've cited it somehow. And then as like sort of a writing tip, something I worked on with my students this year was we want to try to avoid saying like according to source A if we can, because remember the College Board chose that title. They could have easily labeled it source F. So instead of referring to it as source A, as a lead in, it's better to say like, let's say it's an article from Forbes magazine. It would be better to say, according to a 2019 article from Forbes magazine, because that way when I'm reading it, I'm like, oh, okay, Forbes magazine, like that's a prestigious, usually it's like business and stuff. That's a prestigious magazine. So that's a credible source. If you just tell me source A, I'm like, okay, what's source A? Now I do know what source A is because I've read the documents, but help your reader out and prove that credibility. So if you're citing like, let's say it's an expert testimony from somebody, either the author themselves or maybe the author included somebody in there. Say you're citing, I'll just use myself as an example. Not that I would ever be on the College Board's synthesis, but Coach Hall, comma, an AP Lang teacher from Arkansas, comma. That way, if the prompt is magically about AP Lang, then you would know who the person is. So use the credentials of the source or the person to help your argument as well. And so again, you would have the citation at the end of that sentence though. So if you reference Forbes magazine and that was the source, you should still put source A at the end of the sentence as a parenthetical citation. And someone said I do a combination source A last name. That's also fine. I mean, that makes sure that they don't miss it for sure. But you really need to make sure that you have the three sources because it hugely impacts your score if you don't. So before you hit submit, like I said, please double check that you have them and they're visible. Okay, so let me see if there's any more questions about synthesis before we move on to my personal favorite, which is rhetorical analysis. Is it a good structure to do intro, claim, body one, context, example, reason, counterclaim, context, example? That can be a good structure for sure. It really depends on the execution. So what I tell my students to think about is you need at least two main ideas, maybe three. I would be hesitant to do just like one body paragraph and then immediately a counterclaim and rebuttal, unless it's well executed, just because I would be worried that somehow it would seem like you're contradicting yourself. So usually, and this is just what I've seen, it doesn't mean it's a rule, but usually it's good to have two body paragraphs and then your counterclaim and rebuttal. Or you could lead with a counterclaim and rebuttal, or sometimes call it a concession and refutation, and like just to kind of get it out of the way and then have your two body paragraphs. You just want to make sure you're not doing what we call equivocating. So equivocating is when you argue for both sides. We don't want to argue for both sides evenly. You have to pick a side. And no, they really don't care which side you pick. Sometimes the sources, I personally think, kind of like lead you to a side, but it doesn't mean that you personally have to agree with it. And it doesn't matter if the reader agrees with that. It doesn't matter if I'm reading your essay and I would write that essay the way you did or not. What matters is, are you making a convincing argument? So if you're like really confused about the topic, choose the most convincing argument you can make with those sources. It doesn't mean you have to personally believe it. Though that sometimes we can tell when the kid's not really invested, but like nobody's going to come after you because like for instance, on the paper test, it was about cursive, essentially in like handwriting. Nobody is going to come after you because you say that cursive is obsolete. You just make an argument and move on. And prove the argument. Let's see. Someone asked, am I able to send you my rhetorical essay? I don't have the opportunity right now to look at students' essays this close to the exam, but I do have several videos on rhetorical analysis that have essays in them, like essay samples and like how to go through it, which might help answer some of your questions. Someone asked, do we need to use all the sources for synthesis? 3, or is 3 enough? If you've taken a history class, like I think like APUSH or World, you're sort of encouraged to use all the sources. There's nothing that says you need to for AP Lang. You just have to use 3. Most of my students use 4. Now, I did have one student tell me on the last day of school that he, for his test this year, used all 6. That's great. It doesn't mean it's a great essay. I mean, like he is a strong writer, but you don't get bonus points or clout with your reader just because you used all 6 sources. So please don't feel like you have to pack them in. You want to use the evidence to support your point. That being said, it's also okay to skip and ignore sources. So if a source does not fit your argument, like you're like, I don't know how to use it, or if you don't understand it, then just move on to the next one. There should be a way on your screen to actually click the sources tomorrow so you don't have to keep scrolling, which will help save you a little bit of time. But as long as you've got 3 or 4 sources, 3 is the minimum, but 4 is a cushion, then you're okay. Do not be afraid of long sources. I've had my own students tell me like, oh, I just skipped that one because it was too long. Instead of skipping it, there's a few things you can do. You could read the first paragraph and like the topic sentences of the middle paragraphs and then the conclusion paragraph, get a feel for it, see if it's helpful. But don't just like look at it and go, oh, it's too long, I don't have time. Because oftentimes like those sources that are longer actually have really good info. Maybe it's like an example that you could use or like statistics or facts. So don't skip it just because it's long. But it's okay to skim as long as you're skimming with a purpose. How do you layer your evidence and commentary when you have 2 examples in one paragraph? So basically what you do is you're going to have your topic sentence that conveys the main idea of the paragraph, so what you're trying to prove, and then you lead in with evidence, and then you have commentary about that evidence, ideally more commentary than evidence. We don't want to stuff it with evidence. We want more commentary. Then you'd have like some kind of transition word or phrase, and then you would bring up the new evidence. So let's say it's similarly, or for example, or therefore, whatever your transition word is. Then you'd bring up your new evidence, and then you'd have commentary about that. And then you'd have a concluding sentence that ties back to your thesis or your main idea, because sometimes your main idea is, well, not sometimes, but your main idea should be related to your thesis. So I've demonstrated this, and depending on which essay type you're talking about, I've demonstrated this in a couple videos if you want to see, but also looking at the College Board samples, looking at like those more advanced essays that scored like a 5 or a 6. Not every person does it. But several students do if you want to kind of see it in action and you don't want to go hunting for videos. So is it good to use all 6 sources? Sometimes that actually detracts from the quality of the essay. So if you are a really strong writer and you think it's helping, great. But just remember that you have to have commentary. So if you're stuffing in all 6 sources, the thing I would worry about is that you have too much evidence and not enough commentary. Can you use outside sources? That's a great question. You can, but they don't count as you citing a source. So remember how you need 3 sources? Let's say you have personal experience. Like, okay, for the cursive prompt, a lot of students have experience with cursive or not, and they could use that. You are not a source. So that does count as like sort of like evidence and commentary. And it can help your argument, but you don't just get to like be a source, if that makes sense. So even if you bring in outside knowledge, which is okay and it's totally fine, and it can actually in a lot of cases help, but it's not required, it doesn't negate the need for the other sources. Someone asked about planning. I think it's appropriate to plan, and I kind of have a way that I personally do it. I tend to just like write my thesis, either like an abbreviated version of it or the full thing. Since you're typing, you could probably just type it on there and it'd be okay. I tend to plan my main points because I want to have a line of reasoning. And I ask myself, okay, what is the main point that I'm trying to prove? And then what evidence do I have? And then I might, if I have a good idea about commentary, I might make a bullet point for that too. But we're talking like really sparse notes just to have like a pathway. And before I start writing, I look at okay, this is the main idea for body paragraph 1. This is the main idea for body paragraph 2. And I ask myself, is this the best order? Because sometimes the way we start thinking about it versus the way it should be written might be a little bit different. So ask yourself, are the paragraphs in the appropriate order? So if you're supposed to say something is like the most important or whatever, like that should be first. Or if they're like cause and effect or something like that, you want to make sure that they're in a logical order. So just kind of keep that in mind. Should you know your position before reading the sources? Some teachers say yes, some say no. I sort of have this like middle ground stance on it. It's good to have an idea, but for instance, I will tell you, because I write the essays with my students sometimes. When I saw the wind farm prompt, I really didn't have an opinion on wind farms. So I didn't know which factors to consider because I really didn't care. So I just looked at the sources and found the factors that I found most convincing. Now for the handwriting prompt, I would have an opinion on that before I read. So if you do have an opinion, great. But if you're like, I have never thought about this topic before, please don't be upset. Just go to the sources. I did an exercise with my students once a couple years ago with a really old College Board prompt, and I had them choose their stance before they looked at the sources. They had really great ideas, but none of their ideas were in the sources. And that's when I realized like, oh, okay, this could sound good in theory, but it might not work. So I sort of have like just a general stance of like, if you have an idea, go with it. If you don't, then go to the sources. Do you think it's better integrating your evidence for the synthesis essay or not? I'm not sure if you're asking about like embedding it, like weaving it into a sentence, if that's what you mean by integrating, then yes, you want it to read naturally. So we don't want to just like drop a quote in. And usually shorter quotes are better. Please do not choose these like super lengthy quotes because it's not your own words. It actually kind of slows down the flow of your essay and the pacing as well. So you really want to make sure that you're using shorter quotes that you can weave into a sentence of your own. Can personal experience be used as commentary? Yes, because it's not an official source. So you can kind of use it as, it's sort of this like hybrid because it's kind of evidence, but it's also a little bit commentary. So yeah, you can use it if it's relevant to the topic. How much commentary for synthesis? Okay, so I tell my own students, and I don't know if this is going to make sense, but to everybody just in general, but if you have like one piece of evidence, you want to have at least 2 pieces of commentary, but that doesn't always equate to sentences. I've heard some teachers tell their students like 3 or 4 sentences of commentary. I think sometimes that's kind of stretching it. So if you were to like highlight it, which obviously you can't do on the exam, but if you were to highlight your evidence in one color and your commentary in another, let's say your evidence is yellow, your commentary is green. I should see more green on your paper than yellow. So proportionally, there should be more commentary. But at the same time, like how much kind of depends on a variety of factors. How much inside or outside info do we need to include in the synthesis? Technically none. You can, if you're not sure, you can use, like I would rephrase it in your own words, but like the context paragraph that they give you, that kind of tells you, the different perspectives on the issue, but you are not required to have outside knowledge. So use the sources in that case to support your argument. You're not required to have outside knowledge. If you do, that's great, if it's relevant and if you can work it in, but don't lose sight of what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to be using the sources to support your argument. So I don't want you to like, just like think, oh man, I don't have any like outside knowledge. Or like outside evidence. You don't need it. Please stick to the sources as needed and, make sure that you're actually citing the 3 sources or more. Are the essays curved in relation to each other? Great question. Okay, I'm not a math person and I do not speak for the College Board. Here is what I've heard. They norm the essays, or there's like a phrase for it. It's not curved. But basically, you guys writing whatever your prompt is about synthesis tomorrow, they're only evaluating you based on synthesis for that prompt. You are not compared to the people who took the paper test or the first digital test, nor is synthesis compared to like rhetorical analysis. So, because I got a comment on TikTok recently when I said, what tips do you guys have if you took the digital test? And someone said, why should we help you? And I think they actually thought I was a student, which is kind of funny. But I said, well, helping doesn't really matter because it's not the same prompt and you're not compared to each other. And the response was, but yeah, these kids have more time. That's true, but not true. So you're not compared to anybody else. Your essays aren't even compared to other people's. So let's say I'm reading your essay. I'm only looking at what you put on the screen or the page, whatever we're talking about. I am not saying, oh, well, the last essay I read was a little bit better. And I gave that one a 5, so this one has to be a 4. It has to be proven based on the rubric. So there is they do something a little bit with the numbers, but not in a deceptive way at all. So just keep that in mind. It's actually to make it fair. The College Board, I do believe, I know there's a lot of opinions about the College Board, but I do believe they try to make things as fair as possible. So just kind of keep that in mind. Should we write our essay before analyzing all the documents? I don't typically create outlines, but this method feels like it saves time. I don't know. I think I personally I don't know. I like to take notes as I go, but on the computer system, that might be harder. So find a method that works for you, but you do kind of want to keep track of, okay, this is what this source was about. This is what this source was about. And then and when I say outline, I'm talking really quick bullet points. So kind of customize the approach to a way that works for you. Because the way that I would do it doesn't mean that it's the best way for everybody. But if you think it would save time, then yeah, definitely do what you think saves time. But yeah, you can kind of take notes as you read too, just kind of source A is about this, source B is about this. And that way, when you're trying to figure out what your main points are, that could help as well, because you're not having to necessarily rack your brain and be oh, what did they talk about? I just think I try to do things that minimize my stress. I say I do take some of these tests with my students as a mock exam. I don't take the AP Lang test, obviously, but I do try to figure out what it's like for my students to go through it. So I'll do a test with them every once in a while. And I try to do stuff that's going to save me time under pressure. Because sometimes when you're really stressed, you forget your own name. So whatever you can do to make that is legal and fair and not unethical, whatever you can do as far as helping yourself, that's what's important. You can annotate online. Yeah, there is a way to do it for sure. It's not the same as obviously on paper, but you can kind of they have certain parts of their software that lets you annotate. Our teacher has us do it this way: introduce the source, cite it, explain the evidence, explain how it connects back to your thesis, and reference the prompt. Yes, that works. Because that's giving your evidence and commentary. Can you copy and paste from the sources? I've heard that you can't. I'm pretty sure I had either a teacher or a student tell me that you can't. If anyone knows, if you've taken a previous test digitally through the College Board, this rendition, if you want to chime in, that would be super helpful. But I would not count on the ability to copy and paste. How do you not become repetitive using 2 sources per paragraph? Well, you're looking for evidence that has different value or some, I guess. So your commentary might feel a little bit repetitive, but you want to push yourself to think big picture. So what does it illustrate or highlight? What does it tell us? What does it reveal about society? Or why does it matter? So I could see how, yes, it could become repetitive, but also if you only have one layer, sometimes it's underdeveloped. So you really just want to ask yourself, okay, why does the evidence I just wrote matter? And think about it that way, because then hopefully you'll get a little bit of nuance in your commentary. My class just finished the curriculum last week. Yeah, everybody's on a different schedule for sure, especially because of COVID. For the argument essay, since we need to use outside info, how many examples do we need? It kind of depends. You're going to either need probably one main example per paragraph or 2 examples that you can partner together. For argument, usually 2 per paragraph works better for most circumstances, though not all. So maybe 3 to 4 pieces of evidence and just figure out how you're going to distribute that. Okay. Someone said, I took AP Psych and you couldn't copy and paste. Thank you. Because that's what I was worried about, is I don't think you can. And then someone said, A push, there's no copy and paste. Okay, good. My classmates said that they couldn't copy and paste either. Yeah, I think it's just because, like, I don't know. I guess you could argue I'd give you like an unfair advantage or something. So yeah. Okay, so that was synthesis. Let's talk about rhetorical analysis. Now, I know I saw some questions in here about that. I'm trying to, if you have questions, even if you already asked it, feel free to just like rewrite it. I'm not going to be offended. It just like, as I scroll, I like lose track of stuff because there's a lot of comments. But rhetorical analysis, you guys probably already know this, but you're going to be given a passage that is most likely a speech or a letter, though it could be an article or like an excerpt of a nonfiction text. So it's going to be nonfiction. You are looking for rhetorical choices and how those rhetorical choices relate to the rhetorical situation. So basically, rhetorical choices. Let's go over that first. A rhetorical choice is something that the author is doing. So devices are nouns, things like repetition or anecdote. You can use these for sure, but we want to try to also like phrase it in a stronger verb if possible. So instead of saying anecdote, you could say relays a story. Instead of saying repetition, just say repeats. You don't need to know all these fancy terminologies for like different types of things. Like you don't need to know anaphora or epistrophe. If you want to use it, it's okay. But like it kind of feels like name dropping. So if you're unsure, let's say the passage is really hard, basically just ask yourself, what is the writer doing? And so are they creating an enemy? Are they rallying the crowd? Are they flattering someone? These are all choices because it's something the author is purposefully doing for that audience to achieve their purpose. So there are some rhetorical choices that do come up more than others. I have a couple of videos about that on my channel, but don't stress out about like memorizing a bunch of choices. Just kind of ask yourself, like, what are they doing? And then logos, ethos, and pathos, those are appeals. So choices create appeals. So let's say you notice that you would say, oh, that's logos. Well, ask yourself, like, what is making it logical? Is it the facts and statistics? Then write about the facts and statistics and how they're logical instead of saying like uses logos. Yes, the call to action is a rhetorical choice because it's like what they're doing usually at the end of the passage. So that would be something you'd want to analyze as well. How do I build my commentary for rhetorical analysis? Try to connect it to the rhetorical situation. So what I mean by that is like ask yourself why the writer is making that choice for that audience on that occasion. So let's say the occasion is a funeral speech. Well, presumably, let's say they're telling like nice stories about the person who's deceased. They chose those stories for a reason. You're not going to usually, at least in almost every case, you're not going to speak poorly about the deceased, right? So if it's a eulogy, they're probably going to choose either like a funny story about the person or an inspirational story about the person. So first of all, ask yourself, why did they choose this story? Why is it appropriate for a funeral speech? And kind of think about it that way. Or if it's a graduation speech, a commencement speech, maybe they're giving examples of like historical figures. Why did they choose those historical figures and those examples? Why is it meaningful to the audience as they graduate? Because usually for graduation speeches, we try to inspire the crowd. Let's see. Should we talk about the function of the devices or the main message in our thesis? Okay, I want to make sure that's an interesting question. I want to make sure I'm understanding you correctly. So when you say function, do you mean like what it's doing? Because we don't want to define it. I sort of have this like formula that I give my students. It's like a sentence frame or template where it says like in his or her, whatever, a tone word speech, the author does this and this, like, and you would use like good verbs there in order to, and then you want to connect to the prompt. So are you being asked about a message, an argument, or purpose? So we don't want to define the device, but we also don't want or the choice. But we want to try to emphasize what they're doing and why they're doing it. And I like it to be in that order because sometimes if you flip it and you do why they're doing it and then what they're doing, kind of reads awkwardly. So basically, if we want to break it down to simple terms, it's like, this person does these things for this reason. But if you have if you want to see some thesis statements that like I've done, I do have some videos on that, but like there's a bunch of ways to write a defensible thesis. It's technically the easiest point on the exam, regardless of the essay, for sure. So there's ways to make it stronger, but there's also ways to just kind of get it on paper. What were transitioning words? Like, you can use transition words throughout your essay as you're kind of progressing from like one layer to the next, either like in a paragraph or between. For rhetorical analysis, I tend to see people using more like of a phrase and not like a single word. But yeah, transitions are important, or at least like trying to vary your sentence structure. So having those, like, we call them like dependent clauses at the beginning of a sentence, like, so like that way it's not just like subject, verb. And that does help your style as well. So we want to make sure that you're kind of like, you have sentences of different structures and lengths, because it helps make your essay read a lot better. I do have some videos about sentence frames as well. And okay, what's the difference between a choice and a device? Basically, a device is a noun and a choice is a verb. You don't get points taken off if you mention a device. It's just some AP teachers get really picky about this. I prefer the verb form, but like I'm not going to be upset if one of my students writes a device. And I say this because one of my best students last year made a 5 composite on the exam, and we got to actually read their essays. And she always in class used these great verbs. And then I read her essay and she put something like, so-and-so uses an anecdote and blah, blah, blah. And I was like, oh my gosh, I had you for 2 years in class and you never did this. And I actually like was joking with her about it. And she said, Coach Hall, under pressure, I couldn't remember anything. I just knew that that's what I wanted to talk about. So I did it and I didn't have time to go fix it. And you know what? The body paragraphs she wrote were fantastic. So even though her thesis was not the best thesis she's ever written, she still made a 5 composite. So I think sometimes teachers get a little bit like, we want you guys to do these verbs and like stronger thesis statements, but at the end of the day, like you're taking a timed test, and in the year of a pandemic, mind you. So just kind of focus on the stronger verbs if you can. So saying things like, instead of saying uses logos, you could maybe say like provides facts or statistics, whatever it is. Instead of saying like uses repetition, we could just say repeats, and maybe like what it is, or like, let's say it's examples. That's a choice. Offers examples, things like that. So we want to try to use like stronger and more accurate word choice, because that does kind of help. Let's see. Okay, someone wrote back, that makes sense. So, okay, good. So at least I got that question answered. Thank you, by the way. What's the most important thing to remember when creating your thesis? Try to make sure you have at least 2 choices present, and then you want to connect to the prompt. And what I mean by this is you're going to be asked one of 3 things. You're going to be asked about how they convey the message, develop the argument, or achieve the purpose. And sometimes those are very distinct things, and other times they're kind of like they all seem to be really similar. But if you're being asked about a message, you should specify what the message is. So let's say it's a message of perseverance. So you could say something like the author, and then whatever your choices are, in order to convey his message of perseverance to inspire the crowd to whatever. And that way you've kind of got message and purpose combined there, and that's okay. But what we want to do is we want to make sure that you're actually analyzing what they're asking you to analyze. So if they're asking about a message, it doesn't mean that you don't talk about purpose, but you want to make sure that the message is clear in your essay. Also, a pro tip, I guess it's a pro tip, is don't just say, it's like the message or the argument, or even the purpose. Always tell us what it is. Even if you've already said it, phrase it differently, because it's really awkward sometimes to read like, the author does this to convey his message. Okay, great. What's his message? So even if you're like, oh yeah, but I just said it like in the last paragraph, phrase it differently, but say it again. Always tell us what the message is or what the argument is. What has good multiple choice to study tonight? Marco Learning usually has something that you can download, but I think you have to give them your email address. Or I had said previously, you could check out like the College Board, the AP Lang CED course exam description. It's a huge document. Around page 122, they have 17 sample questions that some teachers use in class, others don't. Based on the rubric, would the claim be the rhetorical choice and the evidence be sentences or phrases? Yes, I think so. Based on what you're saying, that sounds right. So the claim is kind of like what they're doing, which is essentially the rhetorical choice, yes. But then you have to prove it, so you need evidence. So you have a claim. What are they doing? Evidence is proof of it, like what they're doing. And then the commentary is why they're doing it. So why they're making that choice for that audience on that occasion. So what are they doing? Give us some proof, and then spend more time explaining why they're doing it. But yeah, the way you phrased it makes sense to me, at least. How do I find rhetorical choices quickly? Some of them are going to stand out to you as you read. So if you can annotate, then I would just jot down. And we want to look for like major choices too. So you might notice that they use a metaphor in like one sentence, but if that's not super significant and you can't write a whole paragraph about it, then I wouldn't really bother with it. What I like to do is I like to look kind of in like sections, kind of like beginning, middle, and end. And I ask myself, okay, what are they doing in the beginning? Because sometimes choices work together. They might be doing two things to like introduce their argument or their point. So first of all, look for bigger choices if they're readily like visible. If they're not, if you're like, I don't know the choices, then still kind of just focus on the first couple paragraphs and say, okay, what are they doing? And then the next couple paragraphs, what are they doing? And if you can kind of divide it up that way, it seems to help. So remember that like choices can be something like flattery, criticism. It could be things like giving examples. It could be trying to rally the crowd. So ask yourself like, okay, in these couple paragraphs, what are they doing? Especially if you feel really lost. Some people like to read the whole passage first and then kind of go back and like rethink it. Other people like to annotate as they go. So it really depends. I think if you're a slower reader or if the passage is really hard, it's probably better to think of it as you're reading it, hopefully, just because it might save you some time. Do we use rhetorical devices to support the rhetorical choice? You can. Yeah, like if you see that there's a couple things working together, that's fine. So sometimes it helps to have like a broader main idea. So like instead of saying like, oh, the writer repeats this phrase, think about like, okay, what are they really doing by that repetition? So like, why are they repeating that phrase? So I'll give you an example. I did this in one of my videos, but I cannot remember which one. My students read FDR's Pearl Harbor speech, and he repeats certain phrases like deliberately and attacked. So instead of saying FDR repeats the words deliberately and attacked, because that kind of narrows your focus, we stopped and said, okay, why is he repeating these words? Well, he was repeating the words because he was trying to create a common enemy. Why was he doing that? Well, he ultimately wanted Congress to declare war. So he had to prove that we had an enemy before he did that. So instead of having the topic sentence be FDR repeats deliberately and attacked, the topic sentence would be stronger if it was like, FDR creates a common enemy, and then kind of talk about the repetition, if that makes sense. That was a somewhat recent video that I did. But it does help if you kind of ask yourself, what are they doing? And you try not to get so tied down to like one tiny thing. The evidence should come later too. Let's see. Should the intro be context, exigence, purpose, devices, and strategy? It can be. That's one way to do it. I know some teachers kind of give sentence frames for that. So the important thing is you want to make sure that you're talking about the rhetorical situation. So we want to know who's giving the speech and why they're giving it, as well as like we need to know what they're doing. So they will tell you like, okay, this person's giving a speech at this college or at this ceremony. Those details should be in your intro too, because it just kind of makes it make more sense. So you can have a sentence of context of like, here's what was going on, and then give your thesis. Just because like otherwise it might sound a little bit abrupt. How should we break up our time for each essay section? This is going to vary from student to student, but in general, since argument is first, I would recommend spending about 35 minutes on argument. So maybe like, since there's not really much to read, just a couple minutes to read the prompt and plan if you're going to plan. That would give you time to write. Then I would move on to synthesis. I would say 10 to 15 minutes to read the sources and do a quick plan. Kind of depends on, and also like if you feel like you need a little bit more time to be successful, that's okay. Just, but like 10 to 15 minutes to read quickly and to plan. I would spend about 40 minutes writing synthesis because it does seem to take a little bit longer. And then if you spend a little bit less time on argument, like only 35 and not 40, that should give you at least 5 extra minutes to read the rhetorical analysis passage and start to plan. And then maybe you'd have like 35 to 40 minutes to write. So I like to have my students come up with a tentative game plan and figure out how long they need for each step. And I would factor in how long it would likely take you to read and plan and write. That way you know when to move on because your timer is just going to be like counting down. So you're responsible for keeping up with your own time. And under pressure, that can be really hard. So if you kind of know, okay, this is when I'm supposed to be getting ready to move on, that can really help. I posted a video earlier today about like tips from people who took the first exam. And a lot of kids said that the synthesis and the rhetorical analysis were harder. So save more time for that. They had different prompts than what you guys will have. And I don't know what their prompts were because we're not supposed to know. I can know the paper prompts. Those have been released. But the digital test, you're not supposed to tell the prompts. But I do think based on what they were saying is how I would approach the test, which is kind of like knock out arguments as best you can, but save time and then spend the time on the more dense essays because synthesis and rhetorical analysis just seem to take longer because there's reading involved. Yes. Someone said if low on time, can I always use diction as a device? Yeah. Because like diction and also connect it to tone because everything is going to have diction, but obviously, I shouldn't say obviously. If you're writing about diction, please tell us what type of diction it is. If you can kind of categorize it, don't just say the writer uses diction because that literally means the writer uses words. So are they patriotic words, inspirational words, like kind of put like a tone word in front of it. That usually helps, or at least like pick out the phrases and talk about why they're meaningful, but try to avoid saying the writer uses diction because technically every writer has used diction. It's kind of like a pet peeve of AP-ing teachers. Yeah, so diction's always there, tone is there, things like that. Would this be considered a choice? The author recounts a famous figure's achievements. Yes, because that tells me what they're doing. So yeah, that would be great. So it's a little bit like more open-ended, but it definitely counts as a choice. So you are on the right track with that. Since we can't switch between the essays, should we only spend 5 minutes reading each or 15 minutes for? Oh, okay. So see, this kind of depends. My students tend to only spend about 10 minutes reading the synthesis sources, 10 to 15. But they also usually need like 5 to 10 for rhetorical analysis to really read and plan. So they factor that in. So you kind of have to ask yourself individually how much time you need because it varies from person to person. Some people might say, oh, I could read a rhetorical analysis passage in 5 minutes and I'm ready to write that essay. Some people might want to plan 2 and they might need 10. So kind of figure out what works best for you. Do you like when students use quotes in their evidence? Yes. I tend to recommend that you use direct quotes. You can paraphrase. It's in the rubric that you can paraphrase. But if you only paraphrase, it kind of reads more like a summary sometimes. And also there's something about seeing quotation marks that kind of is like, oh, it's evidence. So you can kind of mix it up and do direct quotes and paraphrase, not a problem. But definitely at least try to have a direct quote here and there just because it kind of like visually it helps. But that's just my personal opinion. That's not like a College Board's rule. What's the difference between rhetorical device and choice? So I've gone over this a couple times just in case people have missed it, but I do have a video on my channel that does answer that. So if you want to see, and I kind of break it down like how you would write about one versus the other. So If you just type in like rhetorical device or rhetorical choice, Coach Hall writes in the search bar, it should come up. It's also, I believe, on my cram for the exam playlist, because I tried to make a playlist of like the videos that I felt were most useful of mine. So I believe it's on there as well. Can we put the devices in our thesis? Yes, you should, or like at least the devices or choices, whatever you're using. It's like the what. Like you need to say what they're doing and why they're doing it in order for it to be defensible. So whether it's devices or choices, whatever you're using, so like nouns or verbs, it should be in your thesis. Yes. But there's something called like a closed thesis and an open thesis. Either way, the point is you have to say what they're doing. And that's kind of what you're proving in your essay. How do we really develop our commentary? Can you say this is effective because it does this? That's part of it. Really ask yourself why they're making that choice for that audience on that occasion. And I do have a couple commentary videos as well, but the commentary is the why. And sometimes students ignore the question of why they made that choice. And really think about the audience, because if they're writing a letter to a person, chances are, let's say it's a son or a daughter, and it's a mother writing to a son. They're going to make certain choices because it's the mom writing to a son. Whereas if somebody's giving a speech to like a graduating class, they're going to make different choices because they're speaking to a crowd of graduates. So really consider who is speaking and like what their beliefs and values are, who the audience is and what their beliefs and values are. And then like why they're like speaking or writing in the first place. Now, it could also be an article and stuff too. So an article would probably be in response to some sort of event or concern or things like that. But there's still going to be an audience. Ask yourself who would be reading this article. So yeah. And I do have some more videos on that as well. And I don't expect any of you to go out there and look at this right now, but because you guys are taking the exam tomorrow, but I do have a rhetorical analysis ebook that I made that has a lot of like stuff in it, but you guys probably don't have time to read that before the exam. But a lot of the stuff in the ebook is in my videos as well. So if you are curious about rhetorical analysis, there's definitely a lot of videos out there to help. Do we have to cite it? No, you technically don't. So the only time you are required to cite it is in synthesis. Rhetorical analysis, you can put like you said, like line 7 and then the author, not required. Just, I guess it's because you're only looking at one passage. If you were writing a college essay, then yeah, obviously you would. But for the exam, you don't, for the exam, if you don't cite it for rhetorical analysis, it's not a problem at all. It's not in the rubric that you do. So the citations only matter on synthesis. Any advice on how to stay calm? I like what somebody said here that if you do well, you don't get $1 million. And if you don't do well, you won't lose a limb. So that is good advice. Here's what I try to tell some of my students. First of all, if it's hard for you, it's going to be hard for other people. Just because it's hard, it does not mean that you failed. I've had a lot of kids in the past say, oh, I must have failed that. Well, it was a hard test. It was hard for everybody. They did better than they thought. So do not, and this is easier said than done, do not let the self-doubt creep in. And I say this because like as a former athlete, like I threw shot put in college and I played other sports as well. If I had a bad like throw, it didn't. So if you don't know about shot put, you get 3 throws. And if you make finals, you get another 3. If my first throw was terrible, I'd be like, oh my gosh, I'm going to lose and da, 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 da. And then my coach would be like, be quiet. Like you have 2 more throws. Don't jinx yourself and have it be this self-fulfilling prophecy. Just because you had 1 bad throw, you have 2 more. So think of the essays like that too. Like just because it's hard doesn't mean you failed. And even after the test, because you're not supposed to talk about it with your friends, but if other people are like, oh, that was so easy, and you're like, oh my gosh, it was the hardest thing I've ever done, it doesn't mean that they automatically got a 5 and you got a 1. So just trust yourself, believe in yourself, and use what you've been taught to the best of your ability, but try not to get in the middle of the test, try not to be like, oh my gosh, I don't know. Just tell yourself, I'm going to do my best and move on, because there is so much that is involved in your score that like one bad multiple choice question, one bad paragraph, or even one really hard essay is not going to tank you. So try to stay positive and like reshape it. So instead of having that negative self-talk, try to like say like, like I've got this. Okay. I wish you were my teacher. I wish I could have all of you in class. That would be a giant class though. For the rhetorical commentary, we say juxtaposition or placing. You can say, instead of saying places opposite elements, because that's kind of clunky, just say juxtaposes or contrast. So if you're looking for a verb for juxtaposition, just say juxtaposes or contrasts. But what you said is correct. It's just a little clunky there. But good question. Could you hypothetically take the test again, or would you have to take the class again? Okay, I've never had this happen, but I think technically you can just pay to take the test again. I know I read something somewhere where a kid like missed the registration as a junior and they took it as a senior. Not to be like snarky about the College Board, but if you're going to pay for it, they'll probably let you take it. But don't quote me on that. So in theory, maybe, I don't know if I don't think it's a one and done thing, but maybe it is. I've never had a student take it a second time. But I don't know. That is a good question though. It just never come up for me personally as a teacher. I feel like I could do rhetorical analysis in my sleep. Well, that's good. It's my favorite, so I agree with you. But for a lot of my students, well, it's the one that they grow to love over the course of the year. But when we first introduced it, they hate it. And a lot of students, I think like it's an essay where kids are close, but they just don't quite get there as much. So for some people, it's their favorite, but other people, they like the synthesis and the argument. My yoga teacher recommended doing the 4-4 breathing technique. Yeah, if you are into that kind of stuff, and like I think like controlling your breathing is definitely a great way to relieve stress as well. And athletes use it to calm down too. So absolutely, like there's all different kinds of techniques. I think that's a great suggestion as well. What would happen if someone decided not to take the test, instead take the makeup date? Be really careful about that. Make sure you've talked to not necessarily your AP teacher, but at our school, we have someone called an AP coordinator, who's not the AP teacher. She is like an administrator. Because I would hate for someone to like not take it and then not be eligible for some reason to like do the makeup test. So before you do that, please double check with at least your teacher, if not your administrator, because there's certain reasons that you can and can't like postpone stuff. And this is the third rendition of the test. So we're kind of getting down to the wire a little bit. So I would be very careful before you just like don't take it. Do you have to submit your AP test score to college? Okay, so here's the thing about that. I think you get to submit like to one college for free in a certain amount of time after the test. A lot of my students wait until they see their scores and then they choose which, like, because basically they'll be like, oh, this college wants a 3 or this college wants a 4, and they find out what they did and then they send the scores. But I think at that point you have to pay for it. I've also had kids wait. Well, I guess as juniors, yeah, you would send it as seniors when you're applying for colleges. But like the kids in our school, a lot of kids take AP Bio as sophomores and they're like, oh, should I send my scores? And I'm like, no, like just wait because you have your whole junior year usually. So if you're a junior, I would consider it. But some students really do like to see what their scores are before they submit. So, and like once they've decided on their colleges. So it's kind of a personal choice. If you are very confident and you know where you want to go, then maybe by all means, especially if like money is a factor and you can do it for free if you do it sooner. But if you are able to afford it later and you want to wait for whatever reason, that's also fine. I just think it's a really personal choice. The argument essay does not provide any sources, so you have to think of evidence for it. Yes. And, play to your strengths. So, generally students write about history, like historical examples, current events, personal experience. You can also write about outside knowledge. If you're a sports fan and you can make it work, go for it. If you're into theater and you can make that work, go for it. If you're into music, same thing. How long do I have to wait for my scores? Normally the scores come out the first week of July. However, because of all these versions of the test, it's like mid to end July. So for you guys, about a month, like 4 to 6 weeks, I think. And they release the scores by state. I think it's just so that like there's a group of states at a time. And I think it's because like if everybody's accessing all their scores at once, the site will crash. In fact, like it probably has in the past anyway. So it goes on, there's like time, there's dates and times based on where you live. Let's see. If you put a counter argument in your thesis, would you lose points for not having a paragraph for it? Technically, no. Do you have any tips on how I could gain outside knowledge for the argument essay? So since it's the day before the test, think about topics that you're already familiar with. Ask yourself, I don't know which history class you're in, but are there any like events or people from history that you know well? Do you have any hobbies like of things that you know well? Like, are you really familiar with a certain type of music or a certain athlete or something? At this point, try to kind of categorize what you already know and maybe brush up on those things as opposed to like trying to learn something new, because I really don't know what you would like. I don't want to tell you like, oh, go study this, because like you might not even be able to use it for that prompt. So it's just generally a good idea to kind of write down like 5 to 10 topics that I could write about and try to keep them kind of universal. I barely survived AP World as a sophomore. Yeah, AP World I've heard is really hard. Yeah, I don't know why our school does. It's like the only one at our school that sophomores can take. And I had to proctor the exam this year, and they said it was like hard. I don't know. I think it made a few of them be like, I don't want to take AP classes anymore. And I was like, not all AP classes are the same. I don't know. So yeah, but each school does it differently. Our school has maybe like 10 to 13 AP classes, but there's some really we don't offer seminar. We don't offer AP Human Geography. We don't offer AP Psych. There's certain classes that I would love to take, but the school I teach at doesn't offer. Let's see. According to the CDC, eating milk. I mean, yeah, that's true. I'm assuming that's in response to somebody else's comment. Yeah, the site crashed last year. It did. And the year before that, it sort of crashed. I don't know. Like I was able to access my scores a couple years ago, but one of the AP teachers I work with could not get on. Because usually everybody's trying to get on at the same time. This is my first ever AP exam, and I'm afraid. Well, first of all, hey, listen, like kudos to you for taking an AP class in the first place. And then like if I get it, it's stressful, but you already put in the work by taking the class. So that says something. For me, A-Push is easier. Yeah. A-Push is like, there's less to study in terms of like, because there's world history is like a huge amount of stuff. So in some sense, A-Push might be easier. Are we allowed to use songs in our argument? Yes. It kind of depends on why. I've seen kids write about like musical, like composers or even like musicians, as opposed to songs. But I guess if it fit your prompt, then yeah. Is AP Lit harder than Lang? In my opinion, marginally so. So here's the thing about AP Lit, and this is just my opinion. AP Lit, you study poetry, short fiction, and like longer works like novels and plays. And instead of talking about author's purpose, it's more about theme. For some students, that kind of like, that's harder. But I've had a lot of students tell me that because they took Lang and they got used to writing, then it made this transition to Lit easier. I personally I like AP Lang better, but my coworker who teaches AP Lit, she feels the opposite. She's like, AP Lit's easier. So if you are someone who really likes to read and analyze fiction, then AP Lit probably might be a bit easier for you. AP Lang, the reason why I like it is because it's more universal. A lot of you are not going to be English majors. So when you go to college, you're going to have to write research papers and arguments instead of having to analyze a poem. So I think part of the reason why I like teaching AP Lang to juniors is it's a good like foundation. And it also kind of depends on who your teacher is, to be honest. Yeah. Okay. So a couple of you said you feel better now and more prepared. So great. I appreciate you guys like joining tonight as well, because it says a lot that you're willing to learn. Hopefully you're getting value out of this. Okay. What does the extent to which mean? Okay. So that's, they either say extent to which or to what extent or which extent. Basically, remember that things kind of operate on a spectrum. So it's kind of like asking you, like, maybe not always or never, but like in what situations, I guess you could say. So let me look at the actual prompt. The extent to which an apprenticeship is a viable attempt. Okay. So if I were attacking that question, I would say, okay, like I would ask myself, when is an apprenticeship helpful? And I would probably say, okay, well, wait a minute. The kids who are going into a trade, that's probably very helpful for them. When is it not helpful? Well, if you want to go into, like I was an English major, I didn't need an apprenticeship. Now, if you're going to be like a doctor or something, they don't call it an apprenticeship, but you still have to do your rounds of like medical school and all that, and you still have to learn. So I think to what extent would be, you want to maybe think, okay, well, in certain career paths, it's appropriate because you need that like mentorship and hands-on knowledge. But in other majors or other career paths, it's less so. So when they say to what extent, you're kind of differentiating like, okay, in which cases do you need it? In which cases do you not? Hopefully that answered your question. It's a phrase, like the to what extent, like teachers were so used to it, but then I forget that like students don't know what it means. And then I go to explain it and I'm like, well, what type of evidence are you looking for in a synthesis essay? Like, what if there's no factual info? There should be factual info in at least one or two of the sources. I can't think of one that didn't have it. It doesn't mean it fits your argument, but factual info can be helpful, especially if they have like charts or graphs or just they give statistics in the article or something. Those can be helpful because it makes your argument more logical. Also look for like examples. So usually they'll have like an example of it being successful or not successful. Also expert testimony for synthesis would be something they'll maybe look for in the sources. Just things like that. So you don't have to have all of those things, but if you're really struggling, like those would be the things I would look for first. Or like if I was trying to come up with more evidence to make my argument stronger, those would be the things that I would look for. Okay, someone said, I need more practice putting it into the writing. What's the best way to do this with so little time? Okay, so one thing, if you're a visual learner, then one thing you could do is read the released essays from the College Board. That way you're not writing anything the night before, but you're reading what other people have written and you're seeing what it scored. I would only read essays that scored a 4, a 5, or a 6 at this point, because we want to focus on like the stronger essays, because I recommend trying to aim for at least a 4 out of 6 on the rubric. So that would be something that could save a little bit less time. That would be probably my best advice at this point, is if you're still trying to get the gist of it or the hang of it, is to read those essays. So you could type in, they have it for 2018 and 2019, all 3 essays. And then 2020, they just have the rhetorical analysis, but it's on the College Board website. But usually what I do is, like, let's say you want rhetorical analysis. I would just type in the search bar, like AP Lang 2018 question 2 student samples, and usually it pops up. I'm going to be an English major, so that's why I'm taking Lang and Lit. That's good. I think taking both, if you're going to be an English major, is important. Poetry is the worst. I agree. I like contemporary poetry. I just don't like reading all the old stuff about like odes and I don't know, just boring. I'm not your typical English teacher, in case some of you haven't figured that out. We don't do a whole lot of poetry in my classes, and my students seem to be okay with that. My teacher says, when you see to what extent, it means you can defend, challenge, or qualify. That's true. They used to use those words in the prompt and then they took them out. But that's basically like kind of figuring out where you stand on the issue, is either defending it, challenging it, or qualifying it. What would get us a 3 or 4? Okay, so let's talk about a 3 composite first, because that's the easier one to figure out. So multiple choice. I would recommend getting about 55 to 60% correct if possible. At least 50%, but try to shoot for 55 to 60% if possible. So of the 45 questions, we want a little more than half. And then for the essays, a 4 out of 6 on each essay. That should comfortably get you a 3 composite. Now, to get to the 4 or the 5 composite, obviously we need higher proportions. So again, like we'll know more once the exam is over with and scores have been released, sort of. We don't always get all the info we need because the College Board doesn't tell us everything, but there are some like calculators online that can predict your score, but they're just guessing. So for a 4, I would say at least 60% on multiple choice, maybe 60 to 65%. And then maybe like 2 4s and a 5 on the essay if I really wanted to like put myself in contention for that. Anything upwards of like 70% on multiple choice would put you in like either that 4 or the 5 range, depending on the quality of the essays. 80% on multiple choice and like 5s on the essays should be like 5 out of 6 should be a 5 composite. There's ranges, and we can guess like how it works, but I just think there's a lot of variables, especially as you're trying to go for those higher scores. Let's see. If I nail all the essays and bomb the multiple choice. Okay, the good news about that is that the essays are 55% of your composite. And even if you bomb it, you still probably got some right on the multiple choice. So if you say nail all the essays and we're talking like 5s and 6s, but then you only get like 40% of multiple choice, it should still be okay. I mean, I don't know that I've ever truly seen that happen because I give my kids a mock exam, which is like the real exam. I've never really seen that. I have had kids though who are not as strong in multiple choice, but are great writers. But they didn't, with bombing the multiple choice, they still got about 50%. But so like, I don't think you're going to bomb it as much as you think you are. But if you can write strong essays, that's technically worth a higher percentage of your score. So that will help you. I did have kids ask me like years ago, like, what if I got perfect scores on all my essays and only answered like 10 questions right? And like, because my students like a couple years ago like to give me all these hypotheticals, and or they wanted to know if they only answered 1 question but they got perfect, like, you know, that kind of stuff. And it's like, don't think about that. Just take the test to the best of your ability. But yeah, let's see. Okay, how would you respond to the to what extent if you've only said I agree or disagree? So instead of thinking about I agree, just think about like what side you're on, because it's still kind of the same concept. So I don't think it's anything worth stressing over. Just for argument, like essentially like assert a position. That means like take a stance, whatever the stance is. Let's see. Yeah, and then someone gave you a sentence frame here as well, which is good. Do you have a prediction of what the argument prompts would be? I don't. I wish I did. I don't. I don't know what they were on the previous digital test because they haven't released it, but for the paper test, it was about perfection. They, in the past, usually use some sort of like open-ended topic. So we've had disobedience, we've had something being overrated, we've had exploring the unknown, we've had perfection. Surely there's other topics out there, but I don't know. But I would assume it's going to be something a bit more open-ended, so that you can kind of approach it from a variety of angles if you need to. If we support our evidence, even though it isn't logical. Okay, wait a minute. If we support our evidence, even though it isn't that logical or reasonable, it's just kind of iffy, will that be sufficient for a 4? Because line of reasoning is mentioned in the rubric, I believe your argument should make sense. Like it should be logical. So I'd be hesitant to say that it would be okay, just because like the line of reasoning is part of it. So you do want to have a logical argument, meaning like make a claim and prove it. as best you can. And for argument, it's really important to have specific evidence. So we don't want to generalize. What do you look for when looking at commentary? Logical fallacies. Okay, are you asking if, like, as the reader, we look for logical fallacies? Or are you asking for, like, for rhetorical analysis, should you look for logical fallacies? Because I don't personally teach the logical fallacies. So if you're talking about rhetorical analysis, not every passage is going to have logical fallacies. Now, if you're asking as a reader, would I notice if you had a logical fallacy in your argument? Probably. Let's see. During the multiple choice questions, I struggle with texts that use older English. Yeah, a lot of students do. Even as a teacher, it's like not my favorite. So any tips? Sometimes, like, especially like in the 1800s, they used to have these like huge paragraphs. If it has huge paragraphs, kind of stop every like few sentences or so if it's really dense and kind of figure out, okay, what did they just say, as opposed to reading the whole paragraph. Like break it up even like more frequently. If it's really like fluffy language that you don't understand, look for the words that you do know. Because my students said, you know, sometimes the language is like thou cometh, like old words. And I'm like, well, you know what that means. And they're like, well, yeah, it just makes it more annoying to read. So try to like cut the fluff and just figure out, okay, like what is the main idea of this paragraph? What are they actually talking about? Because you technically don't have to understand every single word to still understand the passage. So don't get hung up on like, if you're like really confused, just try to make sense of the words you understand, if that makes sense. Don't try to decipher or like translate every single word because that takes too long. How long do you recommend spending on the reading passages? You're going to probably end up spending more on the reading than the writing because the passages are longer and there are more questions. But as far as like a time limit, it's kind of hard to say because everybody reads at different rates. I would say, as far as answering the question, don't spend more than a minute to a minute and a half on each question, because if you work at that slow of a pace, then you're not going to finish. So use process of elimination and try to answer the questions quickly. If you need a little bit more time and you're like, if I just had a little bit more time, I'd get it right. Okay, but you can't do that on every single question. So sometimes there are times where you just have to make the best guess you can and move on, because you want to make sure you answer every single question too. If I, as a huge Tolkien fan, if I ever mention him during the argument essays, I'm 100% confident. That's a great way to play up your strengths. If it is relevant to the prompt, then go for it. Yeah, someone said the multiple choice order. Yeah, it's different than the paper test. It kind of like alternates. For multiple choice questions, do you suggest reading the whole passage before beginning or reading the questions that... See, here's the thing that's kind of hard about that. For the paper test, I personally like to read the questions first, then go to the passage. But since you can't, once you go past a question, you can't go back to it. I feel like it would make more sense to just do a read through of the passage, just so you know the gist of what's going on, and then look at the question and see if you need to go back to the passage. I feel like for the digital test, I personally would take it differently than I would take the paper test. So do what works best for you. But some of the questions are going to be about certain parts. So let's say it asks you about like lines 20 to 25. I would read a couple lines above it, read those lines, and read a couple below it just to get the gist of it. But I do think it's probably going to help if you've read the whole passage before answering the questions, or at least like skimmed it. I don't know. Like you want to read with a purpose. Like you're not reading to be entertained. The passage hopefully will be interesting, but it's probably not going to be, if I'm being honest. But remember, you're reading with a purpose. You're trying to figure out what they're saying. That's all. Would writing a single sentence as the intro, as opposed to a couple sentences, lose you the sophistication point? I personally think no, because sophistication is built throughout the whole essay. And I think we look more at the body paragraphs, but like, I'm sure there are teachers out there that would disagree. I just think sometimes like a really wordy intro is counterproductive because of the time constraints. So like if I saw an essay that had like a 1-sentence intro and then had excellent body paragraphs, I wouldn't be like, oh, well, they don't get the sophistication point because they only had a thesis. Like, if you earned it, you earned it. Thank you for the videos. Oh, you're welcome. Yeah, I forget that there's still some kids that are taking it on like June 23rd. That's interesting to me, just because like it's like I've never seen it where they've done like 4 versions of the test before. But I mean, obviously it makes it hopefully a little bit more fair for everybody. But I will be reading this year. I don't know which question I'm reading for. Fingers crossed I get rhetorical analysis. But we start reading toward the end of next week. I think I'm assuming I'm reading the paper essays, not all of them, obviously, but I'll be chosen for one question, and there's a group of us. So those that took the paper test, I think their essays will start to be scored really soon. How many passages are in the 45 questions? 5 total. It's going to alternate, but 2 are reading, and those are the comprehension ones, and then 3 are writing. The writing ones are like editing, and those are shorter. But again, like paper test, it goes reading, writing. For this, they kind of alternate, but you'll know. Okay. How much does the intro stuff before the thesis matter? I personally don't think it matters a ton. I've had kids just write essays where it's like a thesis. I tell my own students, try to go for like a sentence or 2 like before the thesis if you can. But if you are panicking or running out of time, just put a defensible thesis down and focus on those body paragraphs. But is it nice to have a sentence or 2 as a reader? Yes, it helps with your flow, but we don't need like 6 or 7 sentences. Do AP readers like a tad bit of humor? I've seen it work really well. Don't force it, but like that could contribute to your authorial voice. So if that's your style and it works for that prompt, go for it. But if you're not somebody who normally incorporates humor, please don't try to do that just for the test. But yeah, anytime, because I've seen it hit and I've seen it miss. But anytime that I can laugh and I'm laughing because I was supposed to be laughing, it's a good thing. But should you all try for humor? No. I'm not funny enough to do that. Like I couldn't make it funny. How should you space out the multiple choice section to maximize efficiency? Really be mindful of your pacing. I would say, someone posted earlier, they said like, what did they say? About 15 minutes for reading passages and 10 for the writing. I think that was actually like, if you're looking for time limits, I think that was kind of a fair suggestion. And that should hopefully give you like a little bit of time of a cushion as well. Okay. I actually think my husband and son just got home, so I might have to end this live in the next minute or 2 because a 2-year-old might be coming in. Hi, Sawyer. Mama's on YouTube. Do you want to come say hi? Sorry, y'all. Come here. Y'all get to meet my son, who's apparently very crabby. I'm also expecting baby 2, in case y'all care. What do you think is a good outline? Outline your main points. So, come here, baby. Outline your main ideas, and then if you can, plan your evidence. Can I pass if I answer every multiple choice question correctly but bomb the essay? Well, even if you bomb the essays, you still should earn at least like a 2, have a thesis and a paragraph. Could you pass? Maybe. Don't tempt fate. Write a quality essay. Yeah, somebody's sad over there. He had a bad day today, I guess. Congratulations. Thank you. Yeah, you guys are prepared. You've got this. I'm trying to see if I missed any other questions. Do AP readers? Oh, I answered that one about humor. Let's see. For rhetorical analysis, should we write each body paragraph for each appeal? No, I personally don't recommend that. So instead of focusing on logic, ethos, pathos, focus on other choices. Like what the writer's doing. Don't ground your essay in only those 3 appeals, because that just feels forced. So I would recommend not doing that. Come here. Do you want to make your first YouTube appearance by crying? Can you say hi? Okay, so this is Sawyer. He just turned 3. And apparently He's having a tough day. So I'm going to sign out. But if you guys have questions, if you leave them on my YouTube videos, I will try my best to answer them tonight and tomorrow morning before your test. Also, I have a TikTok. I have a TikTok, Coach Hall Writes, and I respond over there as well. Yeah. They're saying hi to you. Can you look at the computer and say hi? Hi. Okay. Thank you guys so much for joining me tonight. And like I said, if you have questions, either comment on YouTube or TikTok and I'll try to answer you. All right. Thanks, guys. Good luck tomorrow. You're going to rock it.
Mama, it's a computer.
It is a computer.